existence as life after death, but just dead bodies in the grave, souls sleeping until the return of Jesus, and then we're resurrected. What happens after we die? Do we just remain in the grave and await the resurrection in the last day? Or is there really a life after death? A real departure to be with the Lord in his Father's house, which we can refer to as heaven, the dwelling place of God. Can we still speak of believers going to heaven after they die? Or are we singing lies when we say, for example, with Charles Wesley in the famous hymn, Love Divine, All Love Excelling, that we are changed from glory into glory till heaven we take our place? If so, should we therefore agree with Bob Marley in his song Talking Blues, who says, I feel like bombing the church, now that you knew that the preacher is lying in talking about dying and going to heaven in Jesus' name? Doesn't work, so sorry. Well, these are some of the claims that are quickly becoming commonplace amongst biblical scholars and Christian theologians today about what happened after we die. The affirmation that our future hope is the resurrection of the body and the restoration of all things implies that there is no place for the reality of life after death. And if there is life after death, it should no longer be spoken of as a reality of being with the Lord in heaven, since the Bible does not speak of going to heaven, but of heaven coming down in the new creation. So the argument goes. In light of his perception of the Christian hope, the biblical language of Enoch walking with the Lord and being no more because God took him away, and Paul's desire to depart and be with the Lord, do not indicate a kind of existence after death with God in his dwelling place in heaven. Rather, we're told it is a kind of imagery, a linguistic symbolism, indicating either a soul sleep existence, or perhaps a non-existence, or a linguistic pointer to the present indwelling of the Spirit of God before we die. In any case, life after death is progressively diminished or eclipsed by the shining light of the resurrection in the last day. We all die and wait in the grave with the resurrection in the last day, so we're told. This paper argues that we can still speak of the existence of life after death as a reality based on Jesus' teaching about the resurrection from the dead in Mark chapter 12, verses 25 to 27. More specifically, I wish to affirm that our future hope as Christians is the resurrection from the dead. However, the resurrection of the dead as taught by Jesus in Mark 12, 25 to 27 has both a present and a future dimension. There is a real sense in which we can say that there is a first resurrection in the point of death, and then a second resurrection in the last day. So, what is Jesus saying about the resurrection of the dead in Mark chapter 12, verses 25 to 27? Now, let me stop here and see whether I can. Does anyone know how to make this thing work?
There you go.
That's all right. I mean, if there isn't, it's okay. We'll
Got
just
someone who thinks he might.
No, I might not.
you know how to do it.
I'm not sure that will. Hey, is that?
Yeah, don't worry.
You can just click
If it doesn't work, that's right. Just leave it. So let me read to you the NIV translation of Mark 12.
Yeah.
Is it that? Okay, there we go. So it's up there. So when the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Now about the dead rising, so it's in the present. Have you not read in the book of Moses, in the account of the burning bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are badly mistaken. He is addressing the Sadducees here. A number of scholars interpret this passage not so much as to do with the resurrection of the dead, but with God's dealing with his people. So Traphus observed that Jesus is here speaking of a new dimension of God's protection of his people. That is, If God allows his people to die, and then his promise to protect them cannot be trusted. Thus, an ongoing life after death for his people tend to confirm God's ability to protect his people. Gilgallen focuses on the love of God and states that Jesus shows here that even death cannot thwart Yahweh's love. The love that made Abraham a friend of God, redeemed Israel from Egypt, is the same love that brings the dead to life. Jansen argues that Jesus is merely showing the Sadducees the implication of the God who overcomes sterility and death by the resurrection of the dead. So it's more about God rather than the resurrection of the dead. Trick shows that Jesus is presupposing God's faithfulness to his covenant to the patriarchs. That is, the covenant would be rendered obsolete if the patriarchs are dead. Therefore, they need to be alive beyond death in order to keep God's covenant to them continually applicable. Yet Donahue and Robinson are examples of those who affirm that Jesus is herein teaching some kind of immortality existence, distinctive from the resurrection of the body. However, since they cannot square Jesus' teaching here with Paul on the resurrection, they then deny that this kind of teaching on the resurrection can be traced to Jesus, and argue that it was a later church invention to answer some controversy with the Jews on the nature of the resurrection. I shall show below that there is a real sense in which Paul's teaching on the resurrection is consistent with Jesus. Now let me offer the following 6 exegetical observations from Mark 12:25 to 27. 1. Jesus is responding to the Sadducees' question of the Levirate marriage about what happens in the resurrection of on the last day by distinguishing 2 stages of the resurrection of the dead, a future stage of the resurrection as in verse 25, and a present stage of the resurrection as in verse 26. Secondly, in verse 25, he is revealing the kind of existence of the resurrection in the last day. That is, he is answering the question of the Sadducees who did not believe in the Jews' expectation of the resurrection in the last day. To the Sadducees, if there is a resurrection in the last day, it will be a repeat of what we have now. This means that the practice of Levirate marriage will bring chaos to a family of 7 brothers who all married one woman, as they are bound to content for her hand in marriage. In response, Jesus corrects them by saying that whenever the dead are resurrected, so it's a time thing, whenever the dead are resurrected, that is, in the last day, they will be like the angels in heaven. Here, in responding to the Sadducees, Jesus is also answering the question of the Corinthians. With what kind of body will they, that is the resurrection body, come? And Jesus answered, they will be like the angels in heaven. That is the mode of existence in spiritual bodily form that the final resurrection will attain to. But thirdly, in verse 26, Jesus then returns to speaking about the resurrection of the dead in general. Here, he points to a non-physical resurrection state of existence, which is happening to God's people in the present time while their bodies are in their graves. Drawing on Moses' account of the burning bush in Exodus 3:6, he affirmed that the reason why God identified himself as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob is that the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are still living in God's presence. Since God is the God of the living and not of the dead, the patriarchs are living before God and with God, while their dead bodies lie buried in their respective graves. In this sense, the closest translation to representing what the Greek present passive verb ekeirondai in verse 26 is saying goes something like this. So this is my running translation to verse 26. Now, concerning the dead who are being raised, so present passive, that concerning the dead who are being raised, that is, The resurrection of the dead is already happening in the present, represented by the living, non-physical existence of the patriarchs before God, which is yet to be consummated in the resurrection on the last day. Number 4, in this view, Jesus is teaching two consecutive stages of the resurrection of the dead. There is a non-physical, present resurrection existence, which is indicated by speaking of the dead who are being raised in verse 26. While their bodies are still in their graves, they are living in the presence of God. This will then be followed by the future resurrection in the last day, when they will be raised from the dead in the spiritual bodily resurrection. In the last day, the resurrected will be like the angels in their mode of being in the new creation. The distinction between the two stages of the resurrection is indicated by the expression Hodan Gar, and that's in verse 25. In Mark 12, the order of the two consecutive stages of the resurrection is reversed. Since Jesus wished to correct the error of the Sadducees thinking about the resurrection implied in their story about the 7 brothers, he addresses himself first to the second and the futuristic stage of the resurrection in verse 25. That is, to the resurrection in the last day. By saying, they'll be like angels. That's the resurrection. That's what happened in the resurrection in the last day. But then he returns to give them the whole picture of the dead who are being raised in verse 26. If we put them together in their consecutive logical sequence, Jesus' teaching on the resurrection of the dead runs as follows. Concerning those who are being raised from the dead, verse 26, they are now living in the presence of God with God. But whenever, Hodangar, the dead will be raised in the last day, they will be like the angels in heaven, and thus will neither marry nor are given in marriage. Here we are affirmed that though God binds together marriage between one man and one woman so that no man can render it asunder, death has a very real sense of making the marriage covenant obsolete. That is, marriage is neither applicable nor relevant in the new creation, though perhaps I can sit together with my wife. Number 5, scholars have been speaking of this first stage of the resurrection of the dead as the intermediate state. But I think this is an unbiblical and also a profoundly unhelpful term to explain what happens after death. The intermediate state assumes that since the existence after death, if there is such a thing, is non-physical and accordingly non-bodily, it is therefore spoken of as the intermediate state between this life and the resurrection in the last day. The intermediate state is distinguished from the resurrection existence in reference to the bodily component of the resurrection. Here in this life we have a body. In the resurrection we will have another body. But in the intermediate state we have no body. This assumption of life after death existence as the intermediate state seems to me at least to have helped in diminishing what is observable in Mark 12:26 as the present resurrection state. Scholars refuse to think of the resurrection in any other terms but bodility. However, in Jesus' teaching about the resurrection of the dead, the most important component is not their bodility, but the fact that they are living to God and with God. Is it not possible to observe then with Paul that just as God gives each seed a body, so also to each of the stages of the resurrection of the dead, God gives it a body as he wants? Possibly, the kind of body God gives to those who are being raised from the dead at the present stage of the resurrection is observable in Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration. So there is a body. And we could see that Elijah and Moses, they appeared in bodily form. And number 6, Jesus shows how we should think of what happened to believers at the point of death. Believers are being alive to God and are being with God. This can be said of the patriarchs, but can also be said of Enoch, Elijah, as well as Moses. They are being raised from the dead and are living to God and with God. So when Paul states his desire to depart and be with the Lord, he's simply affirming what Jesus is saying here in Mark 12:26 about the dead who are being raised. To be with Christ carried the same connotation as the patriarchs being alive to God. It is similar to saying that one partakes in the dead who are being raised. We need to accept that there's a real sense in which the believers are resurrected in the point of death. Since this is how Jesus refers to them here in Mark 12:26. The present state of the resurrection is indeed non-physical, but has its own kind of bodily existence which is revealed in the Transfiguration. Yet, Jesus still refers to them as being raised and living before God. Since the only way in which the bodily form of this present resurrection state is observable is in the Transfiguration, I wish to refer to the mode of being of life after death as a Transfiguration existence. Now, moving on to the Sadducees on the resurrection in Acts 23, verses 8 and 9. This is an issue in Bible translation. Although I came independently to the exegetical observations just delineated, I found that this is a less well-known understanding of the Jewish view of the resurrection in connection with what the Sadducees upheld about the resurrection. In the only other reference to the Sadducees' view of the resurrection in Acts 23, 8 and 9, where most translations assume that what the Sadducees denied about the resurrection is that it is a form of angelic spiritual beings, that is, in the last day. But the Greek expression distinguishes between the two forms of resurrection existence, angels on the one hand and spirit on the other hand, and then use the term ta emphotera in Greek at the end of the sentence, which is naturally translated as both, but which most Bible versions render as them all. Now, the NIV translates Acts 23, 8 and 9 as the following. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection and that there are neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees believe all of this. So there's a sense in which they are kind of putting together angels and spirit as pointing to the resurrection at the end of the last day. Most scholars simply assume that what the Sadducees denied about the resurrection is that they will be angelic spiritual beings in the resurrection on the last day. But the Greek clearly indicates that angels on the one hand and spirits on the other should be considered as two distinctive dimensions of the Jews or Pharisaic understanding of the resurrection of the dead, which the Sadducees refuse to acknowledge. On the one hand, the angels represent the futuristic dimension of the resurrection of the dead. On the other, the spirit indicates the present element of the resurrection enjoyed by the patriarchs Enoch, Elijah, and Moses, to name a few of the Old Testament faithfuls. Viviano, in an article in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 1992, observes that Acts 23:8 shows that the resurrection and immortality are not two contrasting stages of life after death. Rather, the survival of the soul or spirit after death is one way of talking about the resurrection, which is understood as life after death. It does not imply restitution or reconstitution of corpses. Thus, he insists that Acts 23 verse 8 should be translated as follows. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection either as angel, that is in the form of an angel in the last day, or as spirit, that is in the form of a spirit life after death. But the Pharisees acknowledge them both. However, I note that even Viviano attributes this summary of the Sadducees' conviction and the Pharisees' belief in the resurrection as Platonic. So, some concluding reflections. Here I shall address myself to three issues regarding the interpretation of Jesus' teaching about the resurrection of the dead that we have observed in Mark 12:25 to 27. First, most scholars deny the existence of the belief in life after death or resurrection in the Old Testament. Four passages are, however, problematic to them. Job 19:25, Isaiah 25 to 26, Ezekiel 37, and Daniel 12 verses 2 and 3, all of which spoke of some form of resurrection as a beyond-death existence. The scholarly way of retaining consistency in advocating this non-resurrection stance of the Old Testament is to relocate these texts either to a later date or to outside influence, or in the case of Ezekiel 37, to a metaphorical usage of the resurrection concept. However, by teaching the resurrection of the dead from the account of Moses in the burning bush, Jesus is indicating that the very fabric of the conception of the resurrection of the dead in terms of life after death belongs to the most ancient revelation of God when he established Israel as a nation by rescuing him from Egypt through Moses. Secondly, there is a consistent hesitance in scholars, even those espousing a high view of the scriptures, of affirming the biblical notion of life after death because it has been largely viewed as the influence of Platonism or of Second Temple Judaism. However, Jesus' teaching in Mark 12:27 and 25-27 clearly shows that the present form of the resurrection of the dead is not Platonism, but represents a strong Mosaic influence. This Mosaic influence on the relation of what is visible to the invisible can be seen throughout the Old Testament in the tabernacle and the temple and all its